We know that England was in World War II right from the very first day. We know that the United States joined the war later on in 1941. So you have to remember that the British had already been at war for about 27, 28 months, even before the Americans became involved. And they started the war with a lot of equipment that they thought would work real well, and it didn't. And every 3 months there would be a different iteration of a particular piece of equipment. For instance, something like goggles or a flying helmet or oxygen masks. Anyway, my buddy Thies here has come all the way from Germany. He lives in Mülheim an der Ruhr, which is right near Essen, right in the Ruhr area, which was heavily bombed during World War II. He's a fellow collector. He speaks very good English. Maybe we'll even get him to talk. He spent a couple of years in Poughkeepsie, New York. His dad worked for IBM, and he learned English the hard way. He had to be able to learn to flip baseball cards, things like that, out on the playground. So he did a good job learning English. One of the things that's real important is that you protect yourself when you're flying an airplane that's open cockpit. Later on, of course, we had enclosed cockpits. But there's always a hazard for fire, and there's always a hazard for freezing, because every 1,000 feet you go up, it's about 2 degrees cooler. So if you're flying at 20,000 feet and it's 70 on the ground, you're talking about freezing temperature at 20,000 feet. So typically you'd start with an inner liner of gloves, which would be silk. And silk is very, very warm, natural fiber. It's good for wicking away moisture and sweat and things like that. And sometimes people would use cotton in warmer climates rather than the silk. On top of that would go a pair of calfskin gloves, and again a layer for warmth. And then on top of that you would have what would be called a gauntlet. Now, it didn't mean that every person would wear all 3 layers. Some people had different preferences for what they were going to wear. The gauntlets started out, obviously in World War I as adaptations to civil type gloves that would be worn. They originally had a zipper up through here, but it was a straight zipper, and they found that they couldn't zip the glove with one hand. Typically you're putting on your gloves by yourself, so somebody came up with the idea that they would put the zipper on a slant. So there's straight zip gloves and slant zip gloves, but one hand could actually zip the zipper, so like that. So very easy to do that. Sunglasses started out, obviously everybody likes to wear sunglasses, and it's always a good idea to have a hook that goes behind the ear. Also, there's a lot of glare up at altitude. People don't like all the scattered light coming in from the side, so the sunglasses have side cups. But the significant thing about these glasses is that the tempered glass is actually 2 layers that are laminated together. And they didn't really have a lot in the way of plastics when these glasses were developed in the 30s. And the best I can figure is that they actually used brushed on nitrate dope, just like what was used on airplanes, and we still use it today with some of the covering methods for the fabric aircraft. And they would basically slide the 2 pieces of glass together, put a little weight on it, and then let it dry. And it would be the nitrate dope that would laminate the 2 layers of glass together. For those of you up closer, you might be able to catch the reflection off the glasses. You notice that they are perfectly flat, and that is to prevent optical distortion from a curved lens, which you might get. You also might notice that the lenses seem to be slightly delaminating, and that is just because they're old. And Those glasses begat another pair of glasses. And these glasses became the more thicker tempered glasses. The shape was slightly modified. And they also had the addition of nose pads. These glasses, they just have like a U at the bridge, and the U of the bridge just sits on the oxygen mask. That would be more comfortable to wear, you know, when you're driving around in your sports car, your MG or something like that. But of course, they were worn. Moving on to the next item, we can talk about the Mae West vest. We'll use this one here first. We talked about the inner tube method. That was pretty much gone in the European area by the time the war started in 1939. There was an intermediate version that was very similar to this. This having K-pox. Like K-pox is kind of like cork. If you could, it does absorb water eventually and it'll let you sink. But it has K-pox here, here, and here, and that's supplemented by a bladder. It looks like a big tube of rubber that is glued together. It's natural rubber. Natural rubber oxidizes over time. They're very, very hard to find because they usually do this thing. It's a good word. The British always have the knack of taking a unpleasant situation and giving it a nice word. So they use the word, the rubber is perished. Okay, so anyway, we don't have a bladder in this one, but you can just imagine that there would be a bladder in this one. And the bladder for the earliest versions of the Mae West would be able to be blown up through a tube, and it would fill up the bladder as you blew into it. There's a valve on the end that you would then shut, and it would lock the air in. The problem with that Mae West was that they didn't want people flying around in airplanes with these bright yellow Mae West Sun, because you could actually see that from a distance, you know. And so they made them like a medium green. It was basically the same exact color as the English Channel. So that if you were in the water wearing this Mae West, and that's really about all you're going to see is the Mae West and maybe a little bit of a head sticking up, you would have somebody that you really just can't see. So during the Battle of Britain, they started figuring out really fast that we need to take some of the yellow paint, just the same kind of yellow that you see around the star on this aircraft, and they would slosh it with yellow dope onto the fabric, and you would actually have those greenish Mae West turn into yellow Mae West, very crude looking. That Mae West begat this Mae West, and this is an awesome garment because it was the foundation for developing a very useful garment that would help everybody all the way around, not only the pilot but also the people trying to do the rescuing. Originally, it would look just like this, except it would have what would almost look like a cape. It's basically like a triangle of cloth, and it would be sewn up here, and then it would go down and it would attach with a handful of snaps, or poppers as the British call them here. And the idea was that if you were down in the water, you could undo the poppers on either side, and that piece, which had a little bit of K-pox in it, would float up, and it would make a much bigger target that could be seen from the air. The problem with it is that in the English Channel, the waves would come. Sometimes it would be a little bit choppy, and the panel would flip up over the pilot's head. And he's trying to breathe. I mean, he's doing all he can to keep air in his lungs, and this thing keeps popping over. So a lot of times, the pilots would go to their rigger, and the rigger would come, and he'd unstitch this, and he'd remove that piece, and he'd restitch it with the red thread. The red thread shows where there's a repair. Whenever the rigger works on something, he always uses a different color thread, so you know that it's been looked at before. This one also has the poppers here, meaning that it originally would have had that cape-like device. They also added handles, and handles so that you could grab the person who is now waterlogged, and you could pull them up into a boat or a rescuing seaplane. They also added a pocket here, which would normally be stitched, but it has a big block of what is essentially watercolor paint that kids, paint things with. And if it's normally wrapped in almost what looks like newspaper with like a tar and asphalt around it, so until you actually unseal this, it is in a waterproof compartment, if you would. If you were to grab this with your hand and yank it, it would tear the stitching that holds it in, open up that watercolor to the sea, and it would begin to melt, and it would leave a big stain in the water that could be seen from the air. And as we know, that kind of stuff is still used today. The other thing they did is they decided that you could improve the visibility of somebody in the water is if you could somehow make their head yellow. So they made this little beanie that you could put on like that as you're floating in the water, and it would make you easier to see. Down here is a toggle rope. It's basically a piece of string about 1/8 of an inch in diameter. It's about 15 feet long. It's coiled up in a sewn-in compartment here. But right here, it's stitched in very lightly, and if the pilot is floating in the water, he can grab that, extend it, and then he can throw the rope to somebody so they could pull him closer to a boat or an airplane. When you fly a seaplane, there are no brakes. There are no brakes. You can't stop unless you shut the engine down. I don't think you're going to want to shut the engine down when you're 2 miles off the French coast. And you're starting to take shore fire. So you usually have to taxi past a pilot that is in the water, and you have to grab him. You might have 1 or 2 chances to do that. And then he could go under from exhaustion, or the enemy can come out and start chasing you away with an E-boat or something like that. So this added a lot to their ability to actually scoop the guy up. They also have ties that pull through around the back. They basically tie there's 3 of them. Yeah, tie a piece. Go ahead. See if you can tie his shoe. Very good. So, and that kind of makes the vest a lot tighter so you don't slip out of it. Early versions of the Mae West didn't even have leg straps, and what they'd find is when people would go unconscious, they'd actually slip out through the Mae West vest. So they added these leg straps which were tied. Doesn't have big clips and metal clips and snaps. The British, fairly practical, wanted to keep it light. It's just web tape that's tied together. This right here would be where a CO2 cartridge could be fired. It's in the bottom of the bladder on this type of vest, and you would yank that forward and it drives a pin into the CO2 cartridge, and it gradually, or actually the original ones, quickly inflated the vest. The problem is that it would inflate it so fast that the CO2 couldn't get around from one side to the other. So this side would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and I can remember filling up a bicycle tire one time, and the bead popped off the rim, and the tube started coming out, and I did all I could to push it back in. I wasn't successful, but you could just imagine how bad it would be if your bladder burst when you're floating out in the middle of the English Channel. So what they did is they took the CO2 cartridge and they necked it down about the middle so that it would inflate one side, and then the other half of the CO2 cartridge would have to leak through that neck down area into the lower part of the CO2 cartridge, and then it could go out into the vest. So they were able to meter how the CO2 went into the vest, and they slowed it down, and by slowing it down it would allow the vest to fill evenly. Okay, T, so you can take that one off. This vest here is pretty much incorporates every modification that was done. And it has the addition of a light that's over here in this compartment. You pull this down. I'm going to gingerly, excuse me. It has a light here, and it has a battery pack. The light is on the end of a long wire, and the light is actually attached to, there's balsa wood that is around the light. And the idea is that you could take it out, stretch the wire, and the light would float, and then you could twist the end of the battery pack here. I actually have it in upside down. You twist the end of this, and it would actually turn the light on, like that. So that way, if you were down at night, you'd actually be able to be seen by a boat or something going by. It's also a good idea to have somebody be able to hear you, not so much shout, because you can get pretty exhausted shouting. So what they did is they added a whistle, and we'll see if this one works. Yes, and so a boat might come by and they'll shut the motor off and they'll listen. And that's your cue in the fog to blow the whistle. Okay, and they'll keep coming a little bit closer, they'll shut the motor off, they'll listen, you blow the whistle, and eventually they'll find you. The other thing this has is a real cool signaling mirror. And it's wrapped up in a nice little cloth bag. And it has instructions on it showing how to use it, and if somebody wants to come over to the living history area later on, I can give a lesson in how to use the signaling mirror to actually signal an aircraft flying far away. Okay, what time? 12 minutes, that's fine. The flying helmet will move right along. Yep. The British pretty much started out the war with flying helmets that did not incorporate what we would call radio gear. That was all adapted later on. And so it started out as just a real nice leather flying helmet. And they are real nice helmets, even without the ear cups and stuff. When it came time to put the radios in the airplanes, they had like a kit that you could sew on that would incorporate these ear cups, and there would be a little receiver in there. It's a little disc, looks like half the size of a hockey puck, and then there would be a foam pad that would kind of go around the outside, holding that in position. And then you'd also have these cotton stuffed ear donuts, they call them. And this is a very quiet flying helmet. I mean, it is very quiet. It is really quiet. I mean, you could fly a very, very loud airplane, like a British Aerospace Jetstream, and you could put this on and you wouldn't hardly hear the motors running at all. It's really, really a nice flying helmet. They also started experimenting with oxygen systems. They originally had a full flow oxygen system. You basically plugged it in, you turn the valve on, and oxygen's constantly flowing out through the hose. The higher you go, the more you twist the valve, if you can remember to do that. Okay, the problem with full flow oxygen is that you always have oxygen around your face. There's no way to blow out, like your breath just basically goes out around the edges of the oxygen mask. And of course your breath has moisture in it. And if your breath has moisture in it, then it's going to freeze. So what would happen is, along this edge, it would begin to freeze to the pilot's cheeks. It wasn't going to work too well, so they had to come up with some better developments. And what they did is they developed what's called the economizer, which then allows what's called a diluter demand oxygen system, which only provides oxygen when you breathe in. So you can switch to the other. This next oxygen system incorporates what's called an expiry valve on the side, and it actually allows the breath to go out through this expiry valve rather than around the edge of the face. It keeps the moisture away. It was a great improvement. Yep. Are you ready?
We got to wrap it up.
Okay. Well, I guess I had a lot more to say than half an hour's worth. They're telling me to wrap it up. If any of you are interested in any more history on this flying equipment, you can come over and see us at the Warbird Living History Group. Maybe later in the week, if there's another British type airplane that's out here flying, or they're going to be talking about, we'll try to make it out again. So everybody have a good afternoon.